1789, 30,000 people converge on a prison that represented so much that was wrong with French society at the time. A prison that represented oppression of the people, their voice, their expressions. The prison also represented the unyielding, uncountable, unchecked power of a king. As 30,000 people stood there as one angry mob, they held their pikes, they pointed their cannons, and they used their voice to get a message across to their king, that no longer would they stand for this oppression, that no longer would they not be seen as equal characters, that no longer they would stand by and watch a king who was there for his own wants, his own needs, and not ruling on behalf of the people. So what we're going to do today, or for this lecture, is you are going to look over one of the main causes of the French Revolution. The period in which you are studying right now is called the Ancient Regime. It just means time before the revolution. So our revolution actually occurs in July 14th, 1789, with this event known as Storming of the Bastille or the Fall of the Bastille. So we need to understand what life was like up until this point to understand why the people of France banded together to bring down what they saw as an unfair regime. So one of the main causes of the French Revolution is notably how outdated and unfair the social order was. That just means how people were classed, what estates they were placed into, how they were ranked and viewed in society. It is important to note why a king would want to structure his society and his people into certain types of groups. A reason why a king would want people to belong to certain groups and to put privileges on these groups and to put parameters on these groups would be you have a king who has to rule over a large area. And to do so back in, obviously, in the 18th century, you didn't have mobile phones and you couldn't just put out tweets like Donald Trump does. So to control your people, you needed them to belong to certain groups and restrict what they could and could not do. King Louis XVI is in charge of a country that has 27 million civilians. Majority, or nearly all of them, belong to the Catholic faith. So that will come in handy as we talk down the track, that they all abide to one religion. However, this society was broken up into 36 provinces, so you could say 36 regions, 36 sort of townships. And within these provinces, there were 170,000 clergy and there are 125,000 nobles. However, then there were some really large and distinctive groups. There were 24 million peasants and there were 3 million middle class, or we will call them in this revolution bourgeoisie, and city workers. So to make sure that they all listened to his words, his laws, his edicts, he needed to maintain them into certain groups. And in the French Revolution, we call our groups, or we call our classes, estates. There was the first, the second, and the third. And what we're going to do within the next 15 minutes is we're going to go through what types of people were in these estates, what were their responsibilities within society and to the king, what privileges did they have as being part of these certain estates, and what grievances. That just means what were their complaints and what were they not content with. So hopefully after watching that very short clip, you can see maybe why there is going to be really built up aggression and anger in a particular estate. So let's have a quick little look over our three estates. First of all, we have the clergy, which is made up of higher clergy and lower, and in a minute we'll go through who belong to those two things. What's notable to notice is that they own 10% of the land. Then you have your nobles, nobles of the sword, choo choo choo, nobles of the court, ha, and nobles of the road, boom. They own about 30% of the land. And then you have everybody else. And everybody else is your bourgeoisie, your middle class, is your urban workers and your peasants. And they own about 25% of the land, which means left over, the king owns about 30%. So, land, why give the percentages right now? Is because land is going to be a major factor in this revolution, and it also helps to provide who actually is making the money and who is exploiting whom. So what we're going to look at now is our first estate. Now you have been given, as part of your Head Start homework, some readings and ultimately some questions. I will answer a lot of your questions through these slides and these PowerPoints, so the notes that you need to be taking are the ones that are presently before you. However, there are a few that I've left out to check that you have actually read additional notes, because one of the key things about being a history student is you need to act and behave like a historian. That means, hopefully, you enjoy reading and you enjoy investigating. You find it interesting to seek out information and decipher it into a way that makes meaning to you. So let's begin with our first estate. It is made up of our higher clergy and our lower clergy. When we talk about our higher clergy, we are talking about our archbishops and our bishops. For us here in Horsham, our bishop is a guy that belongs down in Ballarat, Bishop Connor. Now, when you are a bishop, it doesn't mean that you just run the one parish. You are in charge of multiple parishes, and we in Australia call that a diocese. So you don't run just one church, multiple ones are under your banner. On the other end of the scale in the first estate, we have the lower clergy, which is like our Father Hudson. It is our local priests, our local monks, and our local nuns. Now, these two groups have the same and differing responsibilities. Your higher clergy associates on a daily basis with the king and queen. Because they are archbishops and bishops, they are going to associate with the wealthy. And by doing this, they have a close connection with the king. And the king needs them because they justify that the king is divine and that God is on his side. So that is the main role of the higher clergy. They actually mandate his right to rule and that he is God on earth. Our lower clergy basically do the nitty and gritty. They get down and they do the hard work. That is, they are in charge of social policies, such as they run education for the villages in which they work in. They help the poor. They run charities. They also run and organise the hospitals. They are also the people that the daily villagers, the peasants, go to register their births and their deaths and to have funerals and their marriages. So the lower clergy are a lot more active with the majority of the country, since you would have noticed a few slides ago, peasants are going to make up about 22 million of the country. Now, belonging to the first estate entitles you to a few privileges, and probably the main one is that you are exempt from taxes. Now, in the French Revolution, taxes are going to be a major thorn in people's sides. As being part of the clergy, you only have to pay a free gift every 4 years to the king. And they call that free gift a don garat. And that may be golden crosses, that may be some sort of unbelievably beautiful blessed silk. But you just have to give a gift every 4 years. However, you're exempt from all other taxes. The First Estate also had their own courts. That meant that clergymen could sit and listen to another clergyman who has committed crimes against the peasants, and they would be judged by the clergy, not judged by other courts who are going to judge the middle class and the urban workers and the peasants. Now, when it came to grievances and complaints by this estate, sometimes the higher clergy found it really heavy hitting that they had to care so much and assist so much for the poor and the needy. So sometimes they felt that they were overburdened and by their obligation to help the poor. The lower clergy, on the other hand, they have a different sort of impression of what their complaints are, and their complaints are mainly directed at their superiors, their higher clergy, because they are seeing these men hardly visit rural towns and hardly visit their parishes that are under their banner. But what they are seeing is that these higher clergy, these archbishops and bishops, are happy to take money paid to them by the people and use that money for corrupt things. A lot of the higher clergy were involved in let's just say, little mistresses on the side and sort of things like that. So you have your lower clergy doing the really hard work, making sure the Catholic Church is actually upholding what it profounds to be, which is it proclaims to be godly help for those who need it. And the lower clergy are also seeing that these higher clergy are abusing a particular tax, which we will talk about a bit later, but a tithe, which is a donation given to the church, and that was paid entirely by the third estate that we're going to get to in a moment. Okay, now we come to our second estate, and our second estate is commonly referred to, or you would know them as either being called nobles or aristocrats. They are particularly men and women of normally great wealth, and they normally get given a lot of their privileges just because they were simply born into this group. This group is made up of three different types of nobles. There's noble of the sword, whose job is basically they were commanders and they were generals of the king's army. Then you have your noble of the robe, and they are the people that were mainly in charge of administrative side of things for the king. They were his advisors, they were his intendants, which you would have remembered are his royal governors, went out into the provinces to preach and give the king's message and his word. And also they are made up of the men of the parliaments, which, if you recall, they are our high courts. They have the right to sort of cross-check the king's laws and policies. They can also be a little bit of a limit and a thorn in his side, because they can sort of delay his laws and policies by finding incorrect grammar or such in the laws that he wants to get out. We then have the nobles of the court, who are probably the vision of a noble that you have. They are the ones that lived around Versailles with the king and queen. They are the ones that partied with them. They were mainly family members, so the king's cousins and the king's uncles and aunties and that sort of stuff. And they also are a very small percentage, but also very wealthy, that they can basically make profits off the things that they trade, import, export, and they can make profit off their lands, and they can live a life which is being as a friend and a confidant and a companion to the king and queen. So noble of the sword, he is responsible for helping the king in his military campaigns, helping to make sure that the king's laws actually happen and they can use their force as being part of the army. And they need to be available to the king and queen in any time that there is a war. Noble of the robe, obviously he is in charge of working in the high courts, making sure that the laws and policies of the king are being placed through law and through traditions and structures. They also generally his cabinet of ministers, which means they are men that he deals with on a daily basis, whether it be economy or war campaigns or whatever it is. Now this group had very key specific privileges. One was that they only had to pay a small amount of taxes, and later on you'll learn some taxes of the French Revolution. But hopefully today you will learn what the tithe and the tally is. And also another one is this group only had to pay small taxes, so things that wouldn't break their back, such as the gabelle, which was a tax on salt. And back in the French Revolution, trust me, you needed salt in everything because everything didn't taste very nice. Now this group also were entitled to certain prestiges, honorific prestiges, the privileges that nobody else was entitled to. For instance, nobles of the sword were the only ones that were entitled in the whole of France to carry a sword. They were also entitled to wear a feather in their hat, which was known as a Norman hat, but we'll look at that a bit later. Like the clergy, they also get to be tried in special courts alongside their peers. They're being judged by their peers. That meant a lot of them got off for crimes against peasants and bourgeoisie and urban workers. And also a nice little one, they had the privilege of being only able to keep doves. Nobody else could have a dove, but if you were from the second estate, you got the right to a dove. Also, this group could not be conscripted into the army, though generally if you were born into a family where your daddy and your uncles were great generals, then you just knew that it was your life's purpose to join the army. Now, one thing you must note, and that people make a great mistake is that do not think that all second estate members were wealthy. Particularly nobles of the sword, a lot of them were not wealthy, and actually 60% of them lived in impoverished conditions in the countryside. That meant that they hadn't made a hell of a lot of money off fighting wars. But one thing, or a few things that they did have that the third estate didn't. One, they normally owned some sort of chateau in the country. And by owning their own chateau, which meant they owned their own land, they could charge peasants to work on those lands. And the other thing, this group is so fierce and is going to fight really fiercely to keep their privileges because they realise that the one thing that separates them from the common man is that what they were born to be a noble. They are entitled to this stuff because it is their birthright, and they don't want anyone to take that away. Okay, so now we're up to probably what you would call our most maligned group. This is the third estate. They make up 97% of the population. However, they have the least amount of privileges and they clearly have the most amount of grievances. So don't think when you think third estate poverty and really poor, because not all of these groups, as you can see, there are the bourgeoisie, the urban workers and the peasants, not all of them were living in poverty and poor. So let's start with our bourgeoisie. So our bourgeoisie are basically, they're the ones who own 25% of the land. So remember looking back earlier, the third estate had owned 25% of the land. It is owned by this group. Bourgeoisie is just another word for middle class. And these members included shopkeepers, merchants, they were lawyers, they were doctors, they were factory owners, they were teachers, but probably most important was that they were merchants and traders, which meant their responsibility was they produced most of France's economic growth. They were the ones that had innovative ideas, they were the ones that saw the profits that could be made in the Caribbean. When France took over Caribbean, they used the black slaves over there to work the cotton fields and the cocoa fields, and through that they traded all over the world. And so essentially the bourgeoisie made France's major wealth and also made France a global entity that people wanted to trade with. A grievance of the bourgeoisie is they are really intelligent men. They read really far and wide. They are reading what's happening in the American Revolution. They're gaining all these new revolutionary ideas about equality and representation and liberty and all these sort of things. And they're starting to realise that we make all the money for the country, yet because we're not born into nobility, we're not entitled to any privileges. So their grievance is they want to rise above their station. They want to not be classed as commoners and not be classed as third estate because in their eyes, they are no way closely related to urban workers and peasants. They want to be seen as the new modern nobility. Then you have your urban workers, and they are obviously your city workers. They reside and live in the cities. And at this stage, Paris, the largest city in France, has about 650,000 people, most of which are urban workers. These are people that are domestic servants, so they obviously work for some of the wealthy people that live in the cities. They're factory workers, they work on the docks. We have the famous fishwives. They're labourers, they're skilled and unskilled. So a lot of them are artists, they're trades, they're blacksmiths, they're sort of the hands-on group. Then And obviously one of their major grievances is that because of how bad things can go in the countryside, they're obviously getting upset by the amount of peasants that are flocking to the city for work. And obviously they're upset by the overcrowding that they're living in. Overcrowding leads to disease. They're also quite concerned about the unsafe environments as the country modernises and the factories modernise. They're obviously having to do a lot more work, which entails like steel work and flames and losing limbs. So they're obviously concerned about their unsafe working conditions and the lack of sort of insurance and the lack of backing they have if they become sick or ill. And another real major grievance, and you'll hear this a lot, when bread rises, the people get angry and they will revolt. But the staple food of their diet is bread. And so when the peasants have a really bad harvest and they don't sell the amount of grains that they need to make money, it obviously then makes grain become scarce, which means bread becomes sort of like a privilege. And when it's a staple part of your diet and it goes up from being $1 to $10, it's going to impact on your family quite a lot. And then we have the peasants, the peasantry, which is clearly our largest group of this revolution, 22 million of them. They clearly reside in the countryside, so they're not living in your Paris or your Versailles, where the king and queen are. And they are your farmers and people who work on the farms. And they are responsible, they have a really big responsibility in the fact that they are supposed to feed the nation. They really need God on their side, and they believe that when there's a bad harvest, that is God trying to send a message. So they really need good weather and good conditions to produce bumper harvests, because that's how they're going to make their small profits. And the nation needs them to produce these profits, because when there's a bad harvest, it trickles all the way to the top. Now, the grievances of this group are absolutely profound. The peasants, who are the poorest people in the country, are required to pay all the taxes. They have to pay the tithe, which is what I mentioned that the First Estate get, and the tithe is a tax which is a donation to the church. It is 8% of your yearly wage. If you're a peasant and you have a terrible crop or harvest that year, you have to find 8% of your yearly wage to give back to the church, many of which higher clergy are abusing. They also have to pay a tax called the tally, which is a direct land tax. It's imposed on anyone who's not a noble, and it's based on how much land they own or how much land they're working on. If you're a farmer, you're working on a lot of land. Also, the one that sort of really grinds in their soul and stabs them in the back is that they have to pay certain taxes to nobles. And these taxes are called feudal dues. So that means they have to pay extra money or give over extra food or give up some of their working hours to attend to nobles' lands. And basically, they rent their farms from nobles, and the nobles charge them to farm that land. They charge them to hunt rabbits on that land. They charge them to use anything on that land. So the peasants are burdened by the First and Second Estate. They have all the taxes on their shoulders. You tell me why they might want to revolt by 1789. Okay, the last thing that you need to take away from this somewhat mini, not very large lecture, is that you need to be able to identify these three estates in visual documents, because if you choose a certain section in your exam, you may be required to analyse a visual document. So using the questions that you've got, you'll find that you've got pictures and there's lines everywhere else. Please annotate those pictures. Okay, your first estate is, let's focus on the higher clergy, which is to the left of you. The higher clergy can be seen by certain caps that they wear, and mainly an archbishop would wear a square cap. Don't need to explain, it's obviously square and it's a cap. The other thing that they would quite rightly be holding would be a staff, which is a sort of big steel golden rod, and that rod is sort of a proclamation that God is in their hand, that they're commanding through God. Obviously, you'll be able to tell the clergy through the use of crosses. They also, the higher clergy will wear silks, okay, and that normally shows their higher office and their wealth, which we know that they're getting from the tithe. And then we have our lower clergy, which you'll be able to tell they're not wearing headpieces because they don't have those privileges and they're obviously not associating with the King Queen. And also we can see that they are more closely related to the people that they're preaching to, so they're peasants. They wear cloths as their robes, so they're not showing their wealth because they don't have wealth. Then we have our second estate, our nobility, and let's start with our noble of the sword, the one who is a commander and a general for the army. They have, remember, honorific privileges, so they have prestiges that they're allowed, and one is the ornate hat. And the ornate hat is a hat which has an embellishment on it. Mostly they would go for feathers. So unless you are a noble of the sword, you cannot put a feather on your hat because you do not have that prestige. Notably also, they're from the military, so you're going to find them in a military uniform. You're also going to see that one of their other prestiges and privileges is that they are allowed to carry a sword, so you'll be looking for that. And something that you're going to see from now on through the whole way is look down to the kneecaps, and you're going to see it in the noble of the robe and noble of the court, and some groups that do not have this, but they are wearing culottes. Culottes are sort of like string or something to tie around your kneecap. So obviously if you're a noble, you probably wouldn't use a piece of string because that's not going to show your wealth, but it could be a lovely ribbon or great silk or something of expense. But the point is that your pants are tied up around your kneecap. Then we have your noble of the robe, and you can see that these are the men who are working in the parliament, so they need to dress like a magistrate. They need to dress like a lawyer because they're dealing with these sort of issues. They commonly wear wigs, as wigs are still worn in court today. They also are notably evidenced by their silk robes. Again, they're wearing culottes. Butch, be quiet. And we also have noble of the court. Now, these are the ones that are daily acting with the King and Queen, and we know that a large majority of this group have extreme wealth. So therefore you're going to tell that they wear their wigs too because it's part of obviously the fashion on the court that particular decade, but also that their clothes are tailored, which means obviously that they get sent away and they get beautifully made for them. They are also wearing culottes, and the women, Marie Antoinette is a real fashionista, and the fashion at the time is wearing a nice wide skirt to accentuate or show off your little waist. And then we have our third estate. And we have our bourgeoisie that you have now learnt are quite the money makers, so they actually have money. But you'll notice something about their hat. They're wearing the same type of hat as the noble of the sword. However, it is minus the feather because they do not have the prestige or the privilege to be able to wear an embellishment. So they just have a hat. Also, to show their wealth, because it's the only way they can kind of show that they're distancing themselves from the urban worker and the peasant, they had their clothes tailor-made. However, the silks can't be too extravagant because they don't want to obviously land themselves in trouble. But the one thing that the bourgeoisie can wear is culottes, and that just shows that they are wealthier than the next two groups on this page. Your urban worker is going to become really famous in area study 2, but for this area study, there are a few things that you notice that this group wears. The main one is they wear no culottes, and the reason they wear no culottes, besides the fact that they can't afford the sort of ribbons and the strings that would go around the kneecaps, is they're actually making a statement. They're saying, stuff you privileged groups, we don't want to be like you, we don't want your culottes around our kneecaps, so we're actually going to rebel through our fashion sense. This group generally have a hand around a pike, which is sort of a weapon. They also wear a liberty cap, but this is going to come around the fall of the Bastille, and they're going to have a cockade on that cap, and it's going to have 3 colours, red, white and blue, going to represent the revolution. But they'll be notably, the liberty cap just means the freedom cap. And then we have our peasants. I don't think I need to explain what their dress and get-up would be, but basically rags, because their life was about trying to just make bare minimal enough for their family and hopefully enough to give to the nation so they could make some little profit considering the amount of taxes that they have to pay. So please, I hope that you filled in any of this stuff into your set questions, annotated the pictures.